There is a scale. A plain set of weighing scales, the kind a grocer would use to measure out flour. And for roughly 40 years, it travels. It crosses the Austro-Hungarian Empire and half of Europe, along with the luggage of the most ceremonially important woman on the continent. Vienna, Budapest, Corfu, Cap Martin. Wherever she sleeps, the scale comes out of the trunk first. She steps on it in the morning. Sometimes she steps on it again at night. And the number it shows is, by her own standing rule, never allowed to climb past 50 kilograms. This is the real machinery of the Habsburg court, not the crown jewels, not the double-headed eagle on the gates. A bathroom scale and a measuring tape carried by hand across a continent. The woman is Elisabeth of Austria, Sisi to a family that adored her and to a public that would eventually flatten her into a postage stamp and a tin of chocolates. Empress of Austria, Queen of Hungary, married at 16 to Franz Joseph, the most eligible monarch in Europe. And the central project of her adult life, the thing she gave more documented hours to than any treaty, any audience, any one of her own children, was the management of her own body. One fact reframes everything that follows. This is not a story about vanity. There is a peer-reviewed medical literature that goes back through the surviving record and reads what it finds as anorexia nervosa. So when this gets strange, and it gets very strange, we are watching an illness, running inside a system that rewarded it, in an era that didn't yet have a name for it. It begins in the 1850s, in a palace in Vienna with more rules than windows. Everything that follows is on the record, written down by the people who dressed her, read to her, rode beside her, and, in the end, carried her. Two questions run underneath all of it. How does the most rule-bound court in Europe end up with an empress whose actual full-time occupation is avoiding it? And what does it cost a person when the only territory she is allowed to govern turns out to be herself? And it starts, as these things do, with a wedding everyone half remembers and almost no one finishes. The famous version, the cozy 1955 film, the glossy recent streaming series, stops at the fairy tale. The young emperor is supposed to marry the sensible older sister. He takes one look at the wild 15-year-old instead. Love trips over protocol. Cue the Viennese waltz and the end credits. That version is not wrong, exactly. It just ends at the altar. The archive doesn't. It walks straight past the ceremony and out the far side, into the 40 years the romance edits out. To understand why a tape measure becomes an instrument of state, start with the court she married into. The Viennese court ran on Spanish ceremonial, a protocol imported centuries earlier and then preserved with the devotion of people who genuinely had nothing better to do. There was a rule for who could sit and who had to stand, who could speak first, which staircase your rank entitled you to, how many horses you were permitted. There were rules for which servant could hand the empress what, and in what order, an entire grammar of who outranked whom, enforced as though the survival of the empire depended on the seating chart. Sisi arrived from Bavaria at 16, raised half wild, riding all day, roaming the countryside, and was handed, more or less, a printed timetable of her own existence. The other power in the building was her mother-in-law, the Archduchess Sophie, who treated the teenage empress as a project in urgent need of correction, and who took Sisi's newborn children to raise herself, on the reasonable-sounding grounds that the girl clearly couldn't be trusted with them. Sisi's first daughter would die as a toddler. Her authority over her own household, for years, hovered somewhere around zero. So picture the situation in plain modern terms, and I'll only do this once, because it's the cleanest way in. She was, functionally, the single most famous person in the empire with the least control over her own day. Her face was on everything. Her opinion was wanted on nothing. The one asset the court genuinely prized, and watched, and measured, and praised, was how she looked. So that became the asset she managed. Relentlessly. The way a person manages the only thing they are actually allowed to own. And manage it she did, with a thoroughness that would embarrass a modern wellness brand. Start with the hair. It was chestnut, and it nearly reached the floor, and maintaining it was a daily ceremony that ran 2 to 3 hours. Her hairdresser, Fanny Pfeiffelich, poached from the theater to the scandal of the court, was paid an annual salary roughly equal to a university professor's, dressed in white, and was forbidden from letting anyone else lay a finger on the imperial head. Sisi was so attached to her that she would refuse to appear at official functions if Fanny wasn't available to do the styling. And there was a standing order. After every session, Fanny had to present the loose hairs from the comb for inspection. Account for the casualties. Every fallen strand, reviewed. Sisi, fluent, restless, far smarter than the role she'd been issued, used those hours pinned to the chair to study Greek and Hungarian. In her own diary, she called herself a slave to her hair. We know the fine texture of these rituals largely because of Konstantin Christomanos, her Greek tutor, who kept a diary and watched the hairdressing the way a man watches a small weather system form indoors, describing Fanny burrowing into the waves of it, lifting them, running her fingers along them like rivers she was trying to catch before they could fly away. Then there's the exercise, and here Sisi was, genuinely, decades ahead of her time, which is its own kind of bleak. She had gymnastic equipment installed inside the imperial apartments. Rings hung in a doorway of the Habsburg. Bars, weights, a mat on the floor of a dressing room you can still walk into today. She was one of the finest horsewomen in Europe and rode for hours. She fenced. And she walked, at a pace that turned her ladies-in-waiting into a rotating injury list because the staff were selected partly for stamina and still couldn't keep up with her. Because here's a thing the legend tends to skip. Serving Elizabeth was less an honor than an endurance event. The unofficial job description was, essentially, keep up. Keep up on the forced marches that left courtiers limping. Keep up on the rides. Keep pace with a woman who treated her own attendance as a piece of cardio equipment. The Sisi Museum in Vienna devotes, more or less, an entire section to their collective despair. Picture being assigned, by personal command of the Emperor of Austria, to walk a marble corridor until you can no longer feel your feet, because the most beautiful woman in Europe is restless again. And she was, the whole time, vastly more than the surface everyone fixated on. On a horse, she was untouchable, probably the finest horsewoman in Europe, who took hunting seasons in England and Ireland, and rode lines that unseated trained cavalry officers. She read constantly, wrote reams of her own poetry, idolized the poet Heinrich Heine, and taught herself languages the court had smugly assumed were beyond her. She would lie on a billiard table or sit through the 3-hour hair sessions with a book propped open, quietly building an interior life that no protocol could get its hands on. And the lacing. To hold the waist, which contemporaries put at close to 50 centimeters, she was tightly corseted and sometimes sewn directly into her riding habit so that not a single wrinkle would show. The lacing alone could take an hour, the full dressing process up to 3, occasionally more than once a day. It left her short of breath. After 1870, she gave up petticoats entirely and had her dresses fitted to her like a second skin. That second skin is worth keeping in the back of your mind. It comes back at the very end, and not the way you would expect. The era around her was a quack's paradise, and she had the budget to buy all of it. The record and the museums describe a beauty regime that reads like a 19th century influencer's product line. Face masks, reportedly of raw veal and of crushed strawberries, baths in warm olive oil. None of it medical. All of it, in the period, taken perfectly seriously by a continent that had decided this one woman's surface was a matter of public interest. If she'd had a ring light, she'd have used it. Now the part the title promises. And the part where the jokes stop, because the camera is on a person, not a system. The eating. For long stretches across 4 decades, Elizabeth ate almost nothing in any ordinary sense. At her deepest, solid food largely disappeared from her day. She lived mostly on milk, to the point that she traveled with her own cows and a goat, so a fresh supply followed her across Europe, and for stretches on little more than thin liquids standing in for meals. These were not eccentric little habits. They were the architecture of sustained, deliberate restriction. Her weight was checked every day and written down, and the scale was never permitted past its fixed ceiling. At her lowest, the record places her far below what a frame of her height could safely carry, into the range medicine now calls dangerous, the kind that puts the heart and the organs at risk. One of her own physicians is said to have noted that her breath carried the smell of acetone, which we now recognize as the body running out of fuel and starting to consume itself. She had fainting spells, deep exhaustion, a cough that wouldn't leave. As early as 1860, a courtier wrote that she had developed an aversion to all nourishment and was, at that point, eating essentially nothing. We should be careful here, the way the better historians are. You cannot climb inside a person's head across 130 years and hand down a tidy diagnosis. But the pattern in the documents, the fear of any gain, the daily weighing, the rituals, the secrecy, the exercise pushed well past the point of harm, is consistent enough that the clinical literature treats Elisabeth as one of the earliest well-documented cases of anorexia nervosa in a public figure. An illness, not a regimen to admire. A thing that was quietly killing her in slow motion while an empire stood around applauding the results. Which raises a problem, and she solved it in the strangest possible way. If your entire public value is your appearance, and appearance is age, what do you do at 32? Sisi's answer was radical and, frankly, a century early. She stopped. Somewhere in her early 30s, she refused, for the rest of her life, to be photographed or painted from life. When photographers lurked, she lifted a fan or a leather parasol and walked behind it. Her last official portrait was made when she was around 42. She lived to 60. What that does is almost a paradox. The most reproduced woman in Europe made herself, in person, nearly impossible to see. She built her own myth by disappearing into it, the original no photos policy run by an empress instead of a publicist. And it worked perfectly. The image that froze into the public mind is Franz Xaver Winterhalter's portrait from 1865. Sisi at her absolute apex, chestnut hair coiled and pinned with diamond stars, luminous, ageless, untouchable. Europe fell in love with that painting. It is, to this day, on the fridge magnets. But the painting is a woman in her 20s. The actual Elisabeth kept walking, older, sadder, faster, behind the fan, for 30 more years that almost no one was allowed to witness. You can see the exact trade she made there. To stay perfect forever, she had to stop being seen at all. The myth required the disappearance of the person. And she paid that price willingly, year after year, because the alternative, being watched as she aged, the way every other woman at court was watched, was the one humiliation the system could still inflict on her. So she chose the fan. She chose to become a rumor of herself. There was, in fairness, one arena where Elisabeth got to be something other than a face behind a fan. And it's the part the fairy tale never mentions. She fell hard for Hungary. Not the polite, ribbon-cutting fondness an empress is meant to perform for the provinces. A real, stubborn, politically inconvenient attachment to the one corner of the empire that openly defied Vienna. She learned Hungarian fluently over the objections of a mother-in-law who disapproved and a husband who had flatly told her the language was too difficult. She filled her inner circle with Hungarian confidants. And she threw what weight she had behind Count Gyula Andrássy and the Hungarian demand for autonomy. And it worked. The Austro-Hungarian Compromise of 1867 reorganized the empire into a dual monarchy, and historians generally credit Elisabeth's influence with helping push it over the line. On the 8th of June, 1867, in a church in Budapest, she was crowned Queen of Hungary, and for once, she did not dodge the ceremony. The Hungarians adored her. Which gives you the quiet, devastating shape of the whole thing. The single piece of genuine public power this woman ever wielded, she had to leave the capital of her own empire to find. Vienna kept the portrait. Hungary got the person, and even that, she had to fight her own household to keep. Here is where it looks, very briefly, like she won. By every measure the world used at the time, Sisi had triumphed. Crowned the most beautiful woman in Europe. Queen of Hungary, beloved by a country that the cold Viennese court could never warm. Finally free of her mother-in-law's grip. Traveling wherever she pleased. The project, on paper, succeeded. And then the cost arrives, the way it always does in these stories. Not as a bill, as a series of deaths. The toddler daughter, gone in 1857. Years of depression and restlessness she recorded in her own poetry, long before anyone around her had a vocabulary for it. And in 1889, the one that broke whatever was left, her only son, Crown Prince Rudolph, dead at 30, in a murder-suicide at a hunting lodge called Meierling. After that, Elizabeth wore black for the rest of her life and effectively never stopped moving again. She became the wandering empress, restless across Greece, Madeira, the Mediterranean, one spa town after another, and above all the sea. She had a palace built on Corfu and named it the Achilleon, after the one hero she felt any kinship with, and she filled notebook after notebook with Heine-style verse. She loved storms. On rough crossings, she would have herself lashed to a deck chair so she could sit out in the gale and feel the whole thing while her sailors and ladies-in-waiting turned green below decks. In her 50s, she had a small anchor tattooed on her shoulder, an empress marking her own skin like a sailor. A woman who had spent decades shrinking her body now set about shrinking her presence too, traveling under a false name, the Countess of Hohenems, with almost no staff and no guards. She had spent her entire life trying to disappear. By the end, she very nearly had. Which is how, on the 10th of September 1898, the Empress of Austria came to be walking along a lakeside in Geneva with a single companion, her lady-in-waiting, Countess Irma Stare, and no protection at all. She despised guards. Anonymity, she'd always insisted, kept her safer than any escort could. That same week, an Italian anarchist named Luigi Lucchini was in the city. He had come to murder a different royal, a French prince, lost track of his target, then read in a newspaper that the Empress of Austria happened to be in Geneva, and simply switched. To Lucchini, the specific victim was beside the point. Any sovereign would serve as the message. He couldn't afford a proper dagger, so he had taken a needle file, the small tool used to file the eyes of industrial sewing needles, sharpened it, and fixed it into a wooden handle. As the two women walked toward the steamer, Lucchini lurched into Elizabeth as though he'd lost his footing and drove the file into her chest. She fell. She got back up. She picked up her hat, told the Countess she was fine, and walked the remaining 100 yards onto the ship under her own power. She genuinely did not know she had been stabbed. And here is the detail that closes the whole story, the one you would refuse to accept in fiction. The wound was a puncture no wider than a file, and the corset, that tightly laced second skin, the discipline she had built an entire identity around for 40 years, was bound so firmly across her chest that it pressed the wound nearly shut and held the bleeding inside. It kept her upright. It carried her the last 100 yards and onto the deck. Only when she finally fainted and the Countess loosened her dress to let her breathe did the pressure lift and the bleeding finish what the file had started. She died within the hour. She was 60 years old. Lucchini was caught within minutes by passers-by who didn't even realize a murder had taken place. He got exactly what he'd wanted, front pages around the world. He was sentenced to life and, years later, hanged himself in his cell. The file, the actual weapon, sits in a museum today, because of course it does. Franz Joseph, when they told him, is recorded saying, in essence, that no one would ever understand how much he had loved her. The empire that had spent decades worshipping her face went into mourning for it. And then she vanished into a second, even more durable myth. The sugared 1950s films, the merchandise, the streaming romance, the Sisi of all white gowns and diamond stars and tragic love, endlessly reproducible, eternally 27. The marketing never quite got around to the black dresses, the empty plates, or the 40 years she spent at war with a measuring tape. And the face it mourned was not the one that died in Geneva. It was the painting. The 60-year-old woman in black, behind the fan, on a lake. Almost nobody had been permitted to see her in years. So the world grieved the diamond stars and the chestnut hair and the impossible waist of an immortal 27-year-old who had, in any public sense, stopped existing decades earlier. The empire had fallen in love with an image and quietly mislaid the person standing behind it. The portrait outlived her, and the portrait was the only part it had ever really wanted. Strip away the crown and the palaces and the legend, and what's left is brutally simple. An empress in that court was sovereign over almost nothing. Not her schedule, not her children, not her own front door. The single territory no protocol could annex, no mother-in-law could seize, no ceremony could govern, was the inside of her own skin. So that is the country she ruled. To the gram, until it killed her. They handed her an empire she was never allowed to rule. So she ruled the only country left to her, her own body.